Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on cover crops for disease suppression by Alex Stone of Oregon State University. My name is Alice Formiga, and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. We're a community of cooperative extension service personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many recorded webinars on organic farming topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce today's speaker, Alex Stone. Alex is the Vegetable Cropping Systems Specialist at the Oregon State University Department of Horticulture, and she is also one of the project leaders of the eOrganic community. Also, back in the late 1980s, she worked as an organic vegetable farmer in Massachusetts. After her presentation, which will last about 45 minutes, we'll have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. However, if you have a question at any time during the presentation, you can simply type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. If you don't see the question box, click the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. We'll be reading the questions out loud, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. This program is being recorded, and the recording will be available in the coming week on the extension.org website, along with our many other archived webinars. You can also find the slides for this presentation as a PDF handout at the link which is in your chat box, and I'll be retyping the live link in just a moment again. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to you, Alex, if you'll just unmute your microphone.
All right. Today I'm going to give a very sweeping and rapid overview of research that's been done investigating how to use cover crops to suppress soil-borne diseases. So it will be sweeping and fast, and I'm going to be covering a lot of work that's been done by other people other than myself, as well as some work that's been done by me. So today I'm going to talk about, first, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be well understood examples of cover crop mediated soil-borne disease suppression, and then move into poorly understood examples, and then use some of those more poorly understood examples and talk about how the researchers working in those systems have used their work to design suppressive rotational systems. So to get started, I first just want to mention two resources that I think are very valuable to both farmers and research and extension personnel working in this area. And the first is this old but still new standby, Managing Cover Crops Profitably, which is a SARE publication, now in its third edition, which was published in 2007, so it's been updated with some of the more recent work. And that basically describes all kinds of aspects of cover crops, including issues related to disease suppression, and is an excellent resource, and I'll be showing you a little bit of that today. And then a newer resource that I'm just becoming familiar with is this Crop Rotation on Organic Farms Planning Manual by Chuck Moeller and Sue Ellen Johnson. Chuck's from Cornell. And this is an excellent fundamental resource on planning rotations and how to utilize cover crops in those rotations. So first I'm going to start, as I said before, on what I consider to be well understood examples of cover crop mediated soil-borne disease suppression. And the first one that I'll talk about is how you can use cover crops to extend rotation length. So if you ask a plant pathologist how to manage a soil-borne disease, typically one of the first things they'll say to you is you want to wait it out, or you want to plan your rotation so that you don't plant another susceptible host crop until the soil-borne pathogens that cause the disease have all died out. So just like you and me, soil-borne pathogens, propagules in the soil are alive, and they have a lifespan. And most of them will die before 4 years, although some of them, like those that cause clubroot and fusarium wilt, which are very important diseases in vegetable systems, live longer than that. So lengthening the number of years to essentially wait out those important soil-borne pathogens is a really good management and very predictable management strategy. So here you see on the cover of this new manual that you have sort of a pictogram of a rotation with 4 different vegetable crop type families here, and then 2 more pie sections representing what could be sort of a sod-based rotation to extend your rotation for 2 more years, or some combination of annual and perennial cover crops. And you don't have to have those back to back. You could intersperse them into your vegetable crop rotation. But the goal might be, and as is displayed here, to extend from a 4-year rotation, which is pretty good and manages some diseases, to a 6-year rotation that gives you more management of additional diseases. So in that rotation planning guide, there is a disease appendix written by Meg McGrath from Cornell, and it's a really excellent resource when you're trying to understand how to plan your rotation to manage important soil-borne diseases. And this is just a tiny little bit of that appendix. And basically you see squash family diseases on the left, the pathogens that cause those diseases in the center, and then here in this column, the Y's and the N's mean, Y means yes, rotation does manage this disease, and N means no, rotation will not manage this disease. And if it says yes, then in the parentheses you see the number of years you have to leave in your rotation between susceptible crops to manage that disease. So for example, with squash family plants, gummy stem blight and Phytophthora blight are controlled by rotations of 3 years or more, or less, or 3 or 4 years, for example. And then you see here, when you get into the fusarium diseases, and fusarium crown and root rot, for example, is caused by fusarium solani, forma specialis cucurbitae. This also causes a fruit rot that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and you need a 5-year rotation to manage these diseases. For fusarium wilt of watermelon that I'm going to talk about later in this talk, you need 5 to 7-year rotation. So if you come back to this pictogram here, you can see that adding 2 more years to a 4-year rotation can help you manage some of those difficult squash diseases. So another really well understood mechanism of cover crop mediated soil-borne disease suppression is to use cover crops to improve soil physical properties. And a lot of different soil-borne diseases, for example root rots, are made worse in compacted soils, and there's a variety of reasons for that. And roots grow more slowly, which means that there's more time for pathogen propagules to sense their presence and infect the plant. In addition, slow-growing roots are more leaky, and those substances that leak out of the roots are signals to pathogen propagules to infect the plant. So for reasons like that, plants growing in compacted soils are much more susceptible to root rots. And one of the classic examples of this is fusarium root rot of snap bean that you see here on this slide. Very important soil-borne disease of beans, and very, very much made worse in compacted soils. So if you can identify cover crops and grow cover crops in your rotational system that can improve soil physical properties and break through those compacted layers, you can actually suppress this important disease. This is a chart from Managing Cover Crops Profitably, the SARE publication I talked about before, and you can go in there to look for cover crops that can bring to your rotational system the particular attributes you're looking for. In this case, you come up here under soil impact and you see that this subtopic subsoiling. So these are cover crops that are highlighted here that have that ability to not only to improve soil physical properties by breaking through compacted layers. So in this particular chart, the more black the circle is, it means that that cover crop is better at bringing that attribute to your system. So a circle that's entirely black means that it's a really good subsoiler. And so here you see that sorghum Sudan grass has been identified as being a really good subsoiler. So in a SARE project out of Cornell, they looked at management strategies, including cover crops, to improve soil quality, and they had an emphasis on reducing compaction. And they showed that rapeseed, crown vetch, wheat, and Sudan grass were very effective at reducing compaction and reducing root rot and increasing bean growth. they identified Sudan grass in particular as reducing compaction. And one of the things that they showed is that if you mow Sudan grass, as you see here in this picture, at intermediate height, once, you can actually improve its overall root volume and its rooting depth, and it is actually able to move through compacted layers. And then when you grow beans after that, root rot severity is lower and your yields are higher. So the last sort of what I consider to be a very well understood example is using a cover crop as a physical barrier to soil-borne pathogens. And this particular example is work that's been done at Ohio State University, looking at using cover crops as a barrier to fruit rots of pumpkin. And so you see these very attractive pictures of pumpkins, and they've basically been turned with their bottom sides up to show you these rotten lesions and dirt that's on the pumpkin surface where it was in direct contact with the soil. This is Fusarium fruit rot that you see here. It's Fusarium solani forma specialis cucurbitae, which also causes crown rot, which we saw in Meg McGrath's appendix before. And it's a soil-borne fungus, and it gains entry to the pumpkin plant, the pumpkin fruit, because the pumpkin is resting directly on the soil. So the idea here is to create a barrier using cover crops so that when you grow your pumpkins, their fruit is not in direct contact with the soil. Here you see a picture of a tractor roller rolling a very large biomass good stand of rye, and it's being rolled when it's flowering because that's the time that you can flatten it and crimp it, and it will actually die as the result of that action. And then you can plant your crop, in this case pumpkin, into it, and if you have a really good thick mulch, you will be able to prevent that rot from occurring. So what you see in this picture is a really good cover crop mulch from the rolling of the cover crop here, and a very, very clean pumpkin. There's no dirt and there's no disease, whereas here, potentially there might not be disease in this field, but you can see the dirt that's on the pumpkin because of the direct contact. And so in this case of Fusarium, which is a soil-borne pathogen, it's also, if you had that in this field, you would also reduce the splash dispersal or direct contact of the pathogen with the pumpkin fruit. And so not only have clean, beautiful pumpkins, but also not that rot. So here you see some data from the Ohio State group, which is showing that as you increase the thoroughness of the ground cover with your cover crop, you increase the percent of clean fruit in your pumpkin crop. And here, this is very good ground cover generated by a rye or rye and hairy vetch cover crop mixture that was rolled. Here you see the relationship between the percent clean fruit and the percent fruit that have Fusarium fruit rot. So as the percent clean fruit goes up, the amount of disease that you see goes down. So this is a really predictable result. You could adopt this in various regions of the country and other types of pathosystems in which you're trying to prevent splash of the pathogen from the soil to the plant. And it has a high degree of certainty that that would work. If you want to know more about implementing organic no-till, eOrganic does have a great article by Mark Schoenbeck from Virginia on this practice. And at the very end of that article, he actually links to some videos, including one by Ron Morse, who pioneered this pumpkin system at Virginia Tech, demonstrating organic no-till pumpkin production. And there's information on other reduced tillage strategies there as well. So to move on to what I consider to be sort of poorly understood examples of cover crop mediated soil-borne disease suppression. And what do I really mean by that? Well, as opposed to what I talked about before, where we really sort of understood the mechanism, you know, improving soil physical properties, creating a barrier, or wearing out your pathogen. What I'm going to talk about now is when you're incorporating a cover crop typically, and you're not really sure what the mechanism is or what the impact of that cover crop incorporation is on the sort of pathosystem in the soil. But what we're trying to do is sort of identify which cover crops seem to benefit the vegetable system and suppress disease when you incorporate it, even though we don't really know why that is so. And in the work that I've done on this, and as I read the papers generated by these other systems that I'll describe, what you find is that this is very highly variable, even in a certain location. So you have to repeat experiments often to try to see the patterns and try to see the cover crops that are more reliably suppressive than others. And in addition, these effects are not readily transferable to other soils, cropping systems, and climates because the microbiology associated with a cover crop being incorporated in one soil system or in one climate is not going to be the same as the impact in another situation. So the first system I'm going to talk about is the one that I've worked in, and that is, the disease is root rot of sweet corn here in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. This, as you can see, this is a very serious root rot. It reduced profitability of sweet corn production here in the Willamette Valley very seriously. And it's caused by a soil-borne disease complex that was identified by Beth Hoynacki, a graduate student, and Mary Pelson, the former vegetable pathologist here at OSU. And they showed that Pythium aeronomines, Phoma terrestris, and some species of Drexler were involved in this root rot complex. Heather Darby, who many of you know from her work in Vermont now, actually did her PhD work on this, and she did a lot of work in the field on compost and manures, which I'm not going to discuss, but she did some first step work looking at the impact of cover crop species on this root rot in containers. And so we took two soils, a Clackamas soil and a Chehalis soil, both of known root rot history, and we grew different cover crops in pots with those soils in them and looked at the impact on corn that was grown in those soils subsequently. And Heather trialed a lot of different cover crops. Here's only a selection of that data. And what she found is that oat and Sudan grass seem to be the most suppressive cover crops in containers. My student Mikio Miyazawa then followed this up, and he's been working on this since as a technician in my program. And he also, in field experiments, trialed many, many different kinds of cover crops. And what we found over time is that for winter cover crops, oats seem to be the most predictably suppressive and also generated the highest degree of suppressiveness. And you see some of that data here. The oats are this sort of purplish blue bar, and the fallow is this maroon bar. And here you see percent root necrosis on this axis. And basically, both on the radicle, which is the first root that comes out of the seed, as well as on the entire root system at harvest, oats suppressed root rot compared to the fallow control. One of the things that we found over many years of experimentation is that while oats pretty predictably suppressed root rot, only sometimes did we see a yield increase in the sweet corn. And as many of you who've worked with oat cover crops know, oats are very strong nitrogen immobilizers. And so we did a lot of work both in terms of looking at tissue and in the corn, and what you see here, which is extractable nitrate in the soil, that at 35 days after incorporation, which is when we would typically plant the corn, extractable nitrate was very low in the oats treatment compared to the fallow. And what often we saw is that the root rot was suppressed, which would increase yield, but because of this immobilization of N, we did not see a yield increase. We are looking now into looking at cover crop mixtures using oats of various kinds with vetch in a mixture to see if we can ameliorate the nitrogen immobilization and get a yield increase and also see root rot suppression. And so here's some work that we did this summer looking at two different oats, a spring oat and a winter oat, common vetch, which is the vetch that's commonly grown here in Oregon by vegetable growers, and then oat vetch mixtures. And what we see here and this is a field experiment at harvest, that the two oats are the most suppressive. Common vetch grown not in mixture is somewhat suppressive, but then the mixtures were not particularly suppressive. And in this particular yield trial, we did not see treatment differences in yield. However, John Luna, who worked in the horticulture department here for many years, has done a lot of work on farms with processed vegetable growers looking at how to best use cover crops, including in strip till systems. And in one of his field trials looking at field experiments on 6 farms in the valley, he actually showed that the oat vetch mixture in a strip till system actually did increase yield compared to both the fallow oats alone or a Phacelia vetch mixture. So it is possible that as we move forward and try to look at how to best implement oats or an oat vetch mixture into these rotational systems, that we can actually design a system that does generate increased productivity. So I'm going to move now into talking about 2 excellent examples of cover crop suppression utilizing hairy vetch. The ARS Beltsville, Maryland group has worked for many years, really several decades, looking at how to best use hairy vetch in vegetable systems in the Maryland area. And they say in their 2007 publication, that hairy vetch is the most widely used winter annual legume because of its very strong attributes, winter hardiness, high productivity, and high N content. So hairy vetch has been used in the Northeast and in many other areas of the U.S. due to these very strong and predictable attributes. You can read a lot in great detail about a lot of the work that was done at ARS Beltsville in this publication that you can find from the ARS website. You can just Google this, the title to find it, and you can download a PDF of that. And I'm just going to point out some of the work that they did on disease suppression. So here's some pictures from that publication. Here's John Teasdale showing a very high biomass and vininess of a hairy vetch cover crop. And what they worked out was that they would flail mow the hairy vetch, a very strong hairy vetch stand, so that you essentially created a mulch in place without disturbing the root system. They would then no-till plant tomatoes into that mulch, and here you see the really beautiful tomato crops that they grew in that hairy vetch system. What they found over and over was that the hairy vetch system generated higher yields very reliably than the system they were comparing it to, which was the black poly mulch system. And initially they thought, oh, well, it's because it's a legume, so you're fixing N, and it's an N response. And so they did, fairly typical N response rate experiments and showed that here in the black poly system, no matter how much N you added, it never achieved the yields of the hairy vetch system. And so they looked at other possible explanations for this yield increase. So here you see on the left some work that they did looking at leaf senescence of the tomatoes and also foliar disease severity. And what they found is that the hairy vetch leaves died more slowly than the tomato leaves died more slowly in the hairy vetch system than in the black plastic system, and they showed this several years in a row. So that the tomato plants actually lived longer. And in addition, the foliar disease severity was slowed down, or the advance of disease was slowed down in the hairy vetch system when compared to the black plastic system. And they worked with some molecular biologists to try to understand what the mechanism for that was. And I'm not going to go into those details, but vetch actually altered the physiology and gene expression of the tomato plants that were grown in the vetch system. And it was that altered physiology and gene expression that reduced and delayed senescence and reduced foliar disease severity. And John Teasdale from ARS actually gave a webinar on their work on hairy vetch a few weeks ago. You can find that webinar in our archived webinars at eOrganic. And he actually shows you a little bit more information about that, the gene expression research. So I don't want to steal his thunder. So to move on to another system related to hairy vetch, I'm going to talk about fusarium wilt of watermelon. And this is a very important disease worldwide in watermelon. Here you see the symptoms, the wilting vines. If you do a cross-section of the stem, you see this very characteristic rusty vascular tissue, which is characteristic of a fusarium vascular wilt. In Maryland, probably likely because of all the work that was done at the ARS station there, many of vegetable and other growers were using hairy vetch as a winter cover crop because it is such a great winter cover crop. What watermelon growers discovered is that when they planted watermelon into a hairy vetch field, they actually saw reduced symptoms of fusarium wilt of watermelon in those fields. And they mentioned that to Kate Everts, who was an author of one of this work, or the lead of this work. She's the vegetable pathologist at University of Maryland. And so she and her postdoc, Zhu, actually did a series of really excellent experiments sort of investigating this phenomenon. And what they found is that hairy vetch did suppress fusarium wilt of watermelon, but it varied. The strength of that suppression varied by the cultivar of watermelon that was grown. And historically, in seeded watermelon, or watermelon that you have to spit out the seeds, which we all grew up with, there is actual very strong resistance to fusarium wilt in those seeded varieties. But over the last few years, the watermelon industry has shifted over to seed less watermelon because that's what consumers are demanding, and there is not strong resistance in those cultivars. However, there is partial resistance, and some are more resistant than others. So what they found is that partial resistance in hairy vetch green manures could actually get you up to a commercially viable level of suppression. What they found is that you got more suppressiveness from hairy vetch if you grew a moderately susceptible cultivar than if you grew a very susceptible cultivar. So you only got about 22% suppressiveness if you grew a susceptible variety of watermelon, whereas you increased suppression by 63% if you grew a highly resistant variety. It's not very clear at all what the mechanism of suppression is in this system, although it is fairly it's not highly variable. But what they see is that both the resistant cultivars and the hairy vetch reduce the amount of colonization of the fusarium pathogen into the stems of the watermelon. So in a susceptible cultivar, you have more than 33,000 colony-forming units of the pathogen per gram of fresh tissue. When you grow that susceptible cultivar in hairy vetch, you reduce that by half. If you have a moderately resistant cultivar, you bring that number down considerably to about 88 and then reduce it by 2/3 when that resistant cultivar is grown in hairy vetch. One thing I just want to point out is that fusarium wilt not only reduces yield of watermelon, but it reduces quality by reducing the sugars. And one of the things that they showed is that the vetch actually improved quality as well as quantity. So here in the fallow, the sugar content is 10.2, but when it's grown in vetch, it increases it to 10.9, and that improves the quality and marketability of that watermelon. As an indication of how maybe this is not transferable to other locations, or at least not all other locations, researchers at Clemson University in South Carolina evaluated this method, and they did this in partnership with Kate Everts at Maryland. So they were doing exactly what the Everts group did, and actually the Everts group had the same trials that same year in Maryland. But in South Carolina, hairy vetch nor common vetch were effective in suppressing fusarium wilt of watermelon. The Everts group at the same time showed that not only hairy vetch but also common vetch were effective in Maryland. So it's not necessarily transferable. We are experimenting with some of this in Oregon, and our very, very preliminary data indicate that it's possible that this would work in the Oregon systems, and we're going to be doing some more work on that this summer. So now I want to move into some still poorly understood examples, but then talk about how those researchers are sort of taking the next step in trying to design, using their sort of cover crop by cover crop work, trying to then take that information to design a suppressive rotational system. So the first system I'm going to talk about is some work done led by Jim Davis's group at Idaho, with a focus on both Sudan grass and sweet corn. So this picture is showing two plots in a field that had a long history of potato production and verticillium wilt. And in this picture here, where you see death of the potato crop, for 3 years before this plot was fallowed. Nothing was grown there. In contrast, this plot was grown to 3 years of full season summer Sudan grass crop. So no potato was grown in either of those fields, but this was fallowed for 3 years and this had Sudan grass. And what the Davis group showed is that after 2 years of Sudan grass, you could get 1 year of verticillium wilt suppression, meaning that you could grow potatoes and you would not see strong losses due to verticillium wilt. After 3 years of Sudan grass, you could grow potatoes for 2 years and see a high level of suppression. The Davis group didn't just find Sudan grass without looking at a lot of different cover crops. As is true for most of the systems we talk about, people first sort of start by exploring a lot of different types of cover crops to find out which are most suppressive. And so what you see here in this figure is that here's the fallow. They looked at Austrian winter pea, dwarf Essex rape, Bridger rape, and Sudan grass. And over 2 years, here you see 1990 and here 1991. These represent early season wilt. Here you see late season wilt. That all of these cover crops at some point were suppressive, although Sudan grass really was the most strongly suppressive. So in this case, not only was Sudan grass suppressive, but it did increase yield of potato, and that was shown also in fields that did not have verticillium wilt. So there could be some sort of a growth promoting effect of the Sudan grass. But what you see here in comparison to these other cover crops, that the total yield was higher in the Sudan grass treatment, and that was due, at least in part, to very large tubers production. One of the things, Davis worked with a mycologist at Berkeley, UC Berkeley in this work, and with Huisman, and he has spent his entire career, and he is retired now, but he spent his career looking at what types of organisms colonize crop roots. And in this case, he was looking at what was colonizing the potato roots. And what he showed is that what Sudan grass seemed to be doing was increasing soil populations of Fusarium equisete, which is on potato not a pathogen, but its populations were dramatically increased, particularly after incorporation of Sudan grass, and those populations increased as the amendment rate of Sudan grass increased. And what seemed to be occurring is that the Fusarium was colonizing the potato roots, which seemed to be preventing colonization of the verticillium. So in many cases, the populations of verticillium in the soil were not reduced by these cover crop amendments, but instead the efficiency of colonization was reduced because, presumably, the potato roots were being colonized by these other organisms. A lot of emphasis in Davis's work has been on Sudan grass, but they also did show that sweet corn was almost as effective as Sudan grass in suppressing verticillium wilt, seemingly by a same type of mechanism. So they showed that sweet corn grown for 2 or 3 years in succession increased yield and suppressed verticillium wilt. And not only were Fusarium equisete populations increased, but also potentially this Ulocladium species, and they colonized the potato roots. What they found is that Jubilee sweet corn was twice as effective as super sweet, which they attributed to the fact that Jubilee is a much stronger plant and creates double the above ground biomass than super sweet Jubilee. So a lot of people have criticized the Davis work because they say, well, you know, no potato grower is going to take their field out of production for 3 years to grow Sudan grass, which of course is true. But one of the things that Davis showed is that, yes, to generate suppression the first time around, you need to take it out for 2 or 3 years. Then you can grow potato for 1 or 2 years. But you can generate suppression subsequently by only growing 1 year of Sudan grass. So potentially over time, you could generate a system that would not require this 3 years out of production. So taking into consideration all of the things that the Davis group learned, they basically described a way to take that learning and experience and design an economically viable and suppressive rotational system in Idaho. So this is really direct quotes taken out of his 2010 paper. So he says, you know, Sudan grass is a good forage crop, so you could potentially cut it as a forage in the summer, let it regrow, which would then, of course, improve the root system of the Sudan grass, as we discussed before, and then incorporate it later. You could also have peas followed by Sudan grass so that you could get a crop in that year. And as he showed, you know, you could grow sweet corn grown as a crop, and he actually did that experiment. He showed that you could take the corn cobs off the field and sell, you know, as a cash crop and still get the suppressive benefit of the biomass. He also did work with some other grasses and grain crops which had some suppressive potential, so he describes, you know, you could incorporate those into your rotation and get some element of suppression. So you could take all of these ideas and design a suppressive system that also had cash crops incorporated into it. And then after that he says, well, but you know, in the future, you may be able to create an economically viable system that did at least have 1 year in which you did not actually have a cash crop because of the many benefits of utilizing green manures and rotations. And then also, potentially, in the future, we could have agricultural policies and subsidies that might support farmers in doing this in order to reduce pesticide use and improve soil sustainability. So the last system I'm going to talk about today is another potato cropping system from work that's been done in the Maine potato systems in Aroostook, Maine. And this work has been led by Bob Larkin, who's a plant pathologist at the ARS station in that region. And in this case, they really focus on mustard and Sudan grass cover crops. So the Larkin group has published a lot of literature as they worked over about a decade on developing these suppressive systems. And I only have time to talk about a little bit of their data, but I highly recommend that you go explore more fully this data. So in this particular paper published in 2007, they were looking for cover crops that were suppressive to diseases of potato. And one of the emphases here was on mustard family cover crops, in part because of the idea that these have glucosinolates in their tissues which are toxic to plant pathogens when the cover crop is flailed and incorporated into the soil. In this case, they actually evaluated what was the glucosinolate level of these different mustard cover crops, and they had canola, which is a rape that's actually had glucosinolate content bred out of it. Also others that had moderate levels, and then one in particular, Indian mustard, which has a very high glucosinolate content. They also grew ryegrass and barley and other grasses which have no glucosinolates in them, although potentially other active chemistries. They looked at they used these cover crops in 2 different farm soils with a history of potato production. These particular fields did not have verticillium wilt in them, but they did have scab and scurf, which are very important tuber diseases of potato. And notably here, what you see is that for powdery scab in this one field, that the mustards were effective, as well as this particular ryegrass species, which doesn't have glucosinolates. And Indian mustard, which again has that very high level of glucosinolates in it, was the most strongly suppressive. In contrast, both the ryegrass and the mustards were suppressive to black scurf, whereas the Indian mustard was not. So I think many people think, well, oh, a high glucosinolate cover crop will suppress many soil-borne diseases, but as you see here, you know, the predictability of that is not good. And if you read the Larkin papers, they actually explore this idea of whether glucosinolates were actually involved in destroying plant pathogens in the soil, and they have a fairly complicated answer. But in general, what you see, both in the Larkin work and in other work, is that that's typically only a part of the picture, and likely multiple mechanisms are at work. So in farm number 2, powdery scab was not important on this farm. Instead, common scab was, but we saw a somewhat similar result here, where this particular ryegrass was suppressive, as well as yellow mustard and rapeseed of black scurf, but Indian mustard, again, didn't suppress black scurf, whereas Indian mustard did suppress common scab, which is what's present in this field. So in other work, the Larkin group actually showed that, similar to the work that was done in Idaho, that sorghum Sudan grass did seem to reduce wilt in potato crops. And so they, and again, as I said, they did a lot of other research, which you can go explore. But the next thing that they did, which I think is really forward-thinking, is to really think about what the goals are when you're trying to design a suppressive and a sustainable potato production system. And they clearly articulated goals of a sustainable system, and then specifically designed rotations that they thought would achieve those goals. So, and then they compared these sustainable systems that they designed with what they called the status quo system, which was a 2-year potato rotation, including barley and red clover. So they designed a soil conserving system that featured an additional year of forage grass and reduced tillage, and that was a 3-year system with barley, timothy, followed by potato. Then they added yearly compost amendments to that soil conserving system to develop a soil improving system. And then they created what they called a disease suppressive system, in which they took the results from the work that I showed you just a few minutes ago, as well as a lot of other work, where they knew that these particular cover crops were suppressive to particular diseases, and they designed a rotation that incorporated all of those suppressive cover crops into a 3-year system. And so, to make a very long story short, what they showed is, so here you see the status quo system, and here's the soil improving with the compost amendment, the disease suppressive system, and then this is continuous potato. And what they found, both in terms of black scurf and common scab, that the disease suppressive system suppressed the diseases. Interestingly, the compost amended system increased disease compared to some of the other systems, and that was true for both scab and scurf. So the Larkin group, in their 2011 paper, really want to make sure that you understand that they know that this disease suppressive system is not really economically viable. However, they argue, similar to the argument that was made by Davis and the Idaho group, that you could take the principles and the data that they use to design their sort of more conceptual system to design an economically viable system. And that would be sort of the next step in this more than decade-long series of experiments that we would hope in the future would actually contribute to our understanding of how to design these systems, and then actually help farmers design a system that actually is economically viable for them and manages diseases. So that's my talk for today so far, and I just want to reiterate some of the resources that I talked about at the beginning. I highly encourage all farmers to own copies of these books or use the online versions, both Managing Cover Crops Profitably by SARE, and then the NRAIS Cornell publication, Crop Rotation on Organic Farms. Excellent manuals, excellent resources. And again, I want to point out that John Teasdale from ARS Beltsville gave a great webinar, including more information than I was able to give today on the hairy vetch system and suppression of diseases in tomatoes in their work, and you can find that in our archived webinar series. And I just want to point out that 2 weeks ago, Brian McSpadden-Gardner from Ohio State gave a wonderful webinar on some very recent work that he's been doing in organic systems on cover crops and disease suppression. And I highly encourage all of you to go hear that webinar as well, which is available in our archived webinars. And that is the end of my presentation. So we can take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. If you could just advance the slide one more, then people can see the link to our archived presentations, and there you can find the cover crop presentations that Alex just mentioned. For those of you who joined us a little bit later in the presentation, we're about to start our question and answer session. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can just type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. And if you don't see the question box, you can just click the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. This webinar has been recorded, and it's going to be posted to the link on your screen. And if after the webinar you have additional questions about this, Alex, if you might want to type your email address into the chat box, then people could contact you about this presentation. And if you have general questions about organic farming or about cover crops in general, you can use the question and answer service that eExtension offers, which we're a part of. And the link for that is on your screen. It's extension.org/ask. Finally, we really value your feedback, so we'd very much appreciate it if you could fill out our follow-up survey, which you'll be receiving in an email later today. So let's move on to our questions. They're starting to flood in here. Let's see. The first question is, do you know of any studies on hop cultivation using hairy vetch as a green manure? And this person's from the Northeast, specifically West Virginia.
The question was on hop?
Yeah, whether there's any studies that you know of on using hairy vetch as a green manure cover crop in hop cultivation.
And I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any. I'm sorry.
Okay. Let's see. Here's another question about brassicas have been reported to reduce plant stands of succeeding crops, as in the case of canola and cotton. Have there been similar observations in potatoes or other crops?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure that if I'm aware of that data of using a mustard cover crop and having it suppress growth of the next crop. That is an issue with cover crops in general. One of the things that can happen if you incorporate particularly a very high biomass cover crop, and mustards are typically pretty high biomass. If you plant before that residue has undergone sort of primary decomposition, you can actually, the crop planted into that fairly raw residue can be impacted through phytotoxic chemicals in that fairly raw residue, as well as damping off pathogens like Pythium and Rhizoctonia. So it's always, and that's, I didn't have time to talk about that, but that's another very important thing to know about working with cover crops, is that they can, particularly in the short term immediately after incorporation, and particularly if it's cold and wet, you can have problems with the crop growing early on after that, and it can actually even create a crop failure. So it's really important to understand how to manage that in your particular soils and with the crops and cover crops that you're growing. And feel free to ask a follow-up question if that wasn't particularly helpful. But that's a very critical thing to understand as a grower when you're using cover crops, is that they can be a problem, particularly shortly after incorporation.
Okay. Here's a question about whether or not you know of any research investigating the suppressive effects of aqueous extracts of cover crop plant tissues, either applied to the soil or the foliage.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I am not aware of research looking at sort of, instead of compost tea, like cover crop tea, I guess. And I am not aware of that, and if anyone is, I would be, please send that information to me. I'd be interested in seeing it.
Okay, here's a question about there's somebody who's in New York and suffers from late blight. And so he wanted to know if there's any kind of beneficial cover crops for tomato plants for disease suppression.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, in the ARS system that we talked about with hairy vetch, you know, they showed that genes were induced that reduce disease severity on the leaves. So it's possible, although they didn't have late blight in their systems, that could also potentially reduce development of late blight. Late blight is an extremely virulent pathogen, however, and possibly could overwhelm that kind of resistance. I don't know. I mean, late blight spores can travel great distances, so it's not necessarily a disease that is easily controlled by managing soil that you're planting the tomatoes in, unless you could improve the resistance of the plant. So no, I guess the short answer is no, I don't know of such a cover crop or amendment.
Okay, here's a comment based on the earlier question about brassicas that have been reported to reduce plant stands of succeeding crops. And so in that information that she was talking about, she said that the plant stand reduction was in relation to the rotational scheme between brassicas and other crops, not necessarily as a cover crop.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I didn't really talk about is that, and this is at least somewhat related to the question, because I'm not exactly, again, quite certain how to answer that question, but you certainly, what you don't want to do is grow cover crops that are alternate hosts to pathogens of your cash crops. And in the mustard example, mustards actually are susceptible to white mold, which is a disease on many different vegetable crops, for example, squash and broccoli and cauliflower and beans and carrots, a lot of different vegetable crops. So potentially a mustard cover crop could build up the pathogen during the cover cropping production season, which then could increase risk in subsequent vegetable crops. Potentially that's true, for example, for clubroot, which is a very problematic pathogen of mustard family crops. And it is possible that growing a mustard cover crop could build up populations of Plasmodiaphora, which is the pathogen that causes clubroot, although I don't know specifically how susceptible the various mustard cover crops are to clubroot. But that's potentially what the questioner might be asking.
Okay, let's see. Someone submitted a comment about a paper from 2007 by Matthew Ngoju at Michigan State investigating aqueous extracts of cowpea and hairy vetch. And for anybody interested, I'll type that into the chat box in just a moment. Thank you for that comment.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you very much.
So here's a question about whether adding a cover crop like hairy vetch into the crop rotation too often can cause diseases to build up in the soil due to having repeated legume family crop inputs.
Yes, I mean that is related to what I was just talking about. And in fact, hairy vetch in the Cornell work in that SARE trial, they actually showed that hairy vetch increased populations of a nematode. And it is possible. So, you know, having diversity in cover crops is important, as having diversity in your cash crops. And also, I mean, what I also would just say is that we tend to lump, you know, say, oh, legumes in general all have the same diseases. And, you know, that's a good rule of thumb. But for example, I think there are, you know, as you become more sophisticated and as we have more information, it may be that you need to, that it wouldn't be bad to grow a variety of legumes that were not all susceptible to the same pathogens. But I think that, all of us need to be more sophisticated about understanding the diseases of the vegetables in a vegetable rotation, and then how specific cover crops could either potentially exacerbate that if they're also alternate hosts, or help manage that disease. And it can be quite specific to not just legumes in general, but to particular species or even cultivars of legumes. As you saw in that ryegrass example, in Maine, it was a particular variety of ryegrass that suppressed black scurf, I believe it was, or scab. So it can be quite specific, is what I'm saying.
Okay. Here's a question from the arid Southwest. In this region, what kind of diversity of seeds would you recommend, and how many seed types should one use as a cover crop on pumpkins or grapes?
I have not worked in the arid Southwest, so I think that in order to get cover crop recommendations, I think that you could go to the SARE Managing Cover Crops Profitably book and look at their information on cover crops for the arid Southwest, and or contact people at the university who are working with cover crops in cropping systems in that region. I don't have experience there, so I can't make recommendations specifically.
Okay. Let's see. Here's a comment that someone that says he uses hairy vetch as a living mulch and has had excellent results with beans, brassicas, and other crops. If the hairy vetch becomes too tall, it can simply be flattened.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I don't see any more questions, so let's just give people another moment to submit additional questions. And meanwhile, I just want to tell everybody that the recording for this presentation will be available within the next couple of days at the second link there on your screen, and the slides are there as well as a PDF, so that in case you want to go back and look up any of the resources that Alex mentioned, you can go there and find them. Let's see, one other question here. Do you think that the amount of disease suppression by cover crops can be enhanced? And if so, how?
One of the questions that is often asked is, does quantity matter? Like if you have a very high biomass cover crop, is that better than a low biomass cover crop of the same cover crop? And I've actually been sort of surveying the literature to see if that's true. And I think in some cases that is true, that you can get more suppression from a high biomass cover crop. And you actually saw data supporting that in the Davis example with Sudan grass. So, one thing to do is to get a very good stand and to grow species that are inherently have very high biomass. The other thing that you can do is sort of mow and blow them. So you can, grow a cover crop in place and then mow part of the cover crop so that it's on top of the cover crop strip next to it, and you can actually double the biomass that way. So that's one way potentially of enhancing the suppressiveness of a cover crop in the field. One of the things that I didn't mention in the SARE work with enhancing physical properties is that they showed that growing cover crops that improve physical properties, as well as using mechanical intervention, like ripping to improve soil, to reduce compaction, those two practices together gave you better results than either practice alone. So in that case, integrating management can give you more bang for your buck from your cover crop suppression than simply the cover crop alone. And in general, designing integrated management with cover crops just being one tool, would be obviously a way to get more management through the use of a cover crop.
Okay.
If that wasn't the question that you asked, please clarify. I'm not quite sure what your question was targeted at.
Okay, no, that was good, according to the questioner. So, yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone. And again, the recording will be posted within the next couple of days. And you can see our remaining eOrganic webinars for the winter season at the first link on your screen. We have one webinar on Friday on organic seed breeding for nutrition. And then we have a new webinar next week on the 2012 EQUIP program, and that's on the 29th. So if you look up those webinars, you're welcome to join us for those. So I'd like to thank you again, Alex, for giving this presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us.